Cathy Mulroy was born in Sudbury into a working-class mining family, the daughter of a miner. Cathy was married at the age of 16, and by 19, she was one of the first women hired back into mining giant Inco since World War II. She continued to work there for 30 years. Debbie Field also sought work in a non-traditional sphere. At the suggestion of one of the union leaders, Debbie and 4 others applied for jobs in the smelting area of the steel giant Stelco. Debbie was one of the founding members of the Women Back into Stelco campaign. In this interview, both Cathy and Debbie discussed their experiences working in these roles, in these companies, with their respective unions, and about the impact that this work had on each of their lives. I'm Sue Colley. I'm with Rise Up, Feminist Digital Archive, and we're collecting loads of materials on the history of the women's movement from 1970 to 1990s. And this year we're doing interviews with activists about their experiences. And I'd like to welcome today Debbie Field and Cathy Mulroy, both of whom were very brave and went into very non-traditional jobs as women, Debbie into Stelco and Cathy into Inco. And they're going to tell us about that today. Okay, Cathy, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Cathy Mulroy, and I worked at Inco, which is a mining company in Sudbury, Ontario, northern Ontario. I worked there for 30 years. We were the first group of women to go in there since the war years. They would not let us work together, similar to the stuff that had happened at Stelco, where they separated the women. The men didn't want us there. Their wives didn't want us there. And the reason I wanted to work there, I was in a bad marriage. I wanted to get out of it. I had been married since I was 16. And this was my ticket out. So that's the reason I went.
Can you go ahead and introduce yourself, Debbie?
A pleasure. So Cathy, that is great. You were the pioneers. I came quite a few years later in 1979, and I only worked in the coke ovens for a year. And I went for union and political reasons to see if I could open up a component of the workforce. I had been working as the first equal opportunities coordinator for a union in Canada for OPSEU, which was a white collar, mostly union. And I had a very unfortunate and incorrect romantic idea that somehow the problem was that women needed to make a transition from where we were to somewhere else, rather than let working class women like yourself, Cathy, do what needed to be done. So there were some real problems in my whole approach. And it had to do with the fact that I was also a member of a far left group that had this bizarre idea that we would actually make the revolution by going into hard industry and selling our newspaper to people. And my partner had moved to Hamilton, and we were in a tough moment in our relationship. And I realized that if we didn't live in the same city, we might not make it. So there were a lot of reasons why I did it, none of which I think were good reasons, actually. So it was an interesting process. I think the men were more welcoming by the time I got there. So that'll be interesting, Cathy, for us to talk about that.
Thank you. And maybe you can tell us a bit more about each of your stories as you go along, as we go along with the story. I'm sure you'll give us more details. Okay. So let's start with Cathy and hear about your experience of how you got the job at Inco, Cathy.
Well, like we talked about just prior to opening up this conference, I was 19 years old and I was in a very nasty marriage. I was wallpapering the walls of my apartment, which was geared to income. It was a brand new place, beautiful place, but it was geared to income. But they said we could wallpaper. And while I was wallpapering, Trudeau came on and said Inco would be hiring in a non-traditional role as workers for women. So I called my girlfriend right away and we both went down and applied. and we were there. I was second in line. We were there really early, and they hired the first 10 that was in that line.
Wow.
So I was 105 pounds. I was really tiny. I had no work experience. I had no money. I had no skills. I had nothing. And that's probably why I was hired. And I had a child at home. So
How old was your child?
he was born in 71, so he would be 3.
Wow, incredible. And who looked after him when you went to work?
I moved to Coppercliff, which is a little town just outside of Sudbury. And there was this wonderful Italian lady that lived next door, and she babysat for me.
Wow.
And so that was really good. And then, of course, when I moved back to Sudbury, my mom, of course, my mom.
Fantastic. My story is a bit similar and a bit not similar. So in Hamilton, at that time, there was a very strong union inside Stelco, USCW, United Steelworkers of America 1005. And Cease Taylor was a really kick-ass militant leader of that union. And by 1978, a lot of things were happening in the union movement around women. And certainly, I guess, maybe even Cease knew of your experience. But he mostly saw it as an opportunity to build his own coalition within the progressives within his union. So he did an interview in the local newspaper, the Hamilton Spectator, and it said, my mom, Cease Taylor, my mom worked in the coke ovens when I was a little kid growing up in England. And I encourage women who would like to work to come down and to the Union Hall and we'll talk about it. And in fact, 5 of us came down and we met with Cease Taylor and the executive. And then we launched a case with their blessing, which is, again, I think a different part of the story, right? Certainly the leadership of the union were behind us. And the other part of the story, which I think I've only realized recently, which I didn't even realize in those earlier interviews, was a new generation of bureaucrats were working with the Human Rights Commission. And so the person who actually heard our case was a young progressive lawyer working for the Human Rights Commission of Ontario. So she would have ruled differently than another generation of people might have. We never actually thought that our human rights case would win. When we went down to apply for our jobs, you would fill your application in and there was a different drawer. They actually put it in a different drawer if you were a man or a woman. So we would go down, we fill out our application, they put it in the bottom drawer. And when we did the human rights case, they were able to subpoena all that in the drawers. And they were able to prove that in 1 month of, I don't know, November 1979, I guess, that they hired, 20 guys straight out of high school without looking at my application. And even though I did not have any industrial experience, I did have work experience. And so therefore they discriminated against me. And Stelco received this ruling from the Human Rights Commission, and they hired 180 of us, including all 5 of us troublemakers, and they split us up and put us on different shifts. And that was how I got into Stelco.
Great, thank you. Why don't you talk next, each of you, about your experiences working, the difficulties you faced working in those particular jobs. Do you want to start, Cathy?
Sure. Well, it didn't start off real well for me because I was pregnant and I didn't know I was pregnant. I was only 2 weeks pregnant. But you would think that they would have taken a pregnancy test for the first group of women, but they didn't. I was hit with a 1,600-pound hoist in the stomach. And that's how I found out I was pregnant. And then that was my first time that I was going to meet the company and the union and the power that each of them had. Because being really young and young-minded, I thought the union was the credit union. and that's where my money was going. I was, oh, they're taking money off my check. It must be going into a credit union savings account, right? But when I, yeah, I was really green. When I walked into that room of men, all white men in suits, they talked about me as if I wasn't there. They kept referring to me as she. So when I walked into the room of all those men in suits and they were talking about me as if I wasn't there, they said they didn't want to set a precedent, which I had no idea what a precedent was. I thought it was like the United States president or something. So anyways, they told me to go home and they put me on something called compensation. Well, I was at home getting money and I didn't have to pay taxes. Oh, good for me. Right. But when I got back to work 6 weeks after the baby was born, I was put back in the anode, which is similar to the casting areas in Stelco. It was really difficult. And then were mad because I was off being pregnant and the boss was mad. So I already was, labeled something before I even had a chance to start working really.
So my story with the union, as I said, was a little different than Cathy's in the sense that they really helped. But I don't know how Cathy felt about it, but for me, for sure, there was a really big difference between the leadership of the union and then, of course, the guys, the rank and file members. And part of what I think went wrong in my story was, again, that the bureaucracy of the union, the leadership really was very disconnected from the membership in our situation. And I'm sure in yours at Inco too. I mean, they were talking about, thousands of people. I think there were 13,000 people at Stelco when I went. So, it was one thing for Cease Taylor to think it was a really great idea. It was another thing for the hundreds of men that I worked with in the COCA who actually hated the union and didn't trust the union and would have felt that the union was, they had a really great game around trying to figure out who. They knew I was somehow a spy for somebody, but they couldn't figure out for who. And they, of course, could never have visualized that I was there as a plant for a tiny little far left group. So they had spent a lot of time trying to figure out why I was there. So the guys would say to me, you're writing a book. You're a journalist. And then once they said, you're a spy for the union. So that was the level at which they mistrusted that I was somehow all these alien forces, whether it was the newspaper or the union, these were outside forces very far away. So what never happened was Cease Taylor reaching out to the union steward, reaching out to me and the union. I mean, I can visualize again how it would have gone 100% differently if, the union steward, who was one of the few people who was really, really good to me the whole time, if we had a strategy to work it through. Because what I think we were so naive about, Cathy, and I don't know if you agree, having worked there for so long, is that I have a very different take now on politics in general, how you change people's minds. Like, when I think about what it would be like to change the minds of people who voted for Trump, let's say, I have a very different strategy now than I had when I was 28, right? Where I thought that it was just a question of putting my demands out there. Now I see that differently. So what never happened was any conversation with the men about the significance of this massive hurricane, me and this one other woman. And in our case, what Stelco did, which was very smart, they refused to give us a washroom. They refused to give us private washrooms. When you worked in an industrial situation, your shower room, your change room, your bathroom, these are all huge, important issues. And so they did bring in a trailer, and they made that the women's trailer. And that meant that's where we would go. We'd walk in. I mean, Stelco, I don't know, again, Cathy, if same thing, Inco must have been huge. I mean, we're talking kilometers. Yeah, so you'd walk in and you'd go to your trailer, and that's where all the 180 women went at one point during our 3 shifts. Did you have 3 shifts, Cathy?
Yes.
Yeah, so that was the other thing, very complicated shift work. So we would go there, we would change, and then we would walk, many of us, a great distance to, the coke oven, the blast furnace, or the various mills that we were going to. And then when we were there, we did not have a private washroom. So we would go into the men's washroom, and they put up one tiny little partition so that the guys could still use the urinals. But like, you know, I'd go in the bathroom and I'd walk out, and there would be like, you know, I remember this one day, this, you know, what seemed to me a very older guy, Italian background, who didn't speak English. And he, you know, he's washing his hands. He's just peed, and there I come out, and we're having to share the same washroom. So for sure, the company set us up. They really saw this as, you know, we'll put up with this for a very short period of time. And nobody really problem solved any of the complexities for us, as if we were staying, from conversations with the men to washrooms.
So you were going to talk, I think, a bit, Cathy, about what it was like in your workplace with your fellow.
It was really awful.
management.
Okay, it was really awful. I remember when I put my first grievance in, that's when I met my best friend at work, Bruce McKagan. And Bruce had just become a steward. So for 30 years, he was always my steward. And the company did not like us because we became really good friends. Things along the way, I got involved with the union. They sent us to Hamilton to learn the right to refuse unsafe work. And we were the first to use it at Inco. So Inco did not like us then either. Now, throughout the years, it was horrible. Like the men treated us badly. The bosses treated us badly. Me. They would make these jobs where I'd go underneath the furnaces and clean, which probably hadn't been cleaned in 100 years, and it was never good enough. So they would send me back under there again. And you're hoping that there aren't any rats, because the rats at Inco were gigantic. They were huge animals. So I was kind of nervous about that. Men write stuff on the wall, same as at Stelco. Cathy is a slut. Cathy is a pig. I had electrical staples in my driveway during snowfall, 4 flat tires. Men would call my children, telling them that I was giving blowjobs on the catwalk. And then men would follow me. I was raped. There was so many things that had happened, and I couldn't tell anybody. Who was I going to tell? So I started writing everything down. That was my outlet. Everything on scraps of paper, on cigarette packages, you name it. And then when I retired, I got a young woman to gather up all that information and put it in files. And then I wrote my book. It took 15 years because I was very sick for 15 years. And little by little, I got the book done. And that was my healing. I feel completely healed with all those things that happened. And when people read the book, they come up to me in the grocery stores and, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us? Who was I going to tell? We did have Dave Patterson, which was a friend of C's. We became progressive. And then we ran Dave Patterson for the District 6 office, which was a big mistake on our part because they buried him, the steelworkers buried him, and we were left with the right wing of the union. And then it got really bad. I couldn't even go in the union hall without my brothers calling me a whore, or, you know, you go to get up to the mic and they all boo you. And, you know, I still went to my meetings and I sat on the left right beside the microphone, and I always said something, whether it just be a little complaint. I always said something at a union meeting, but it was never in the minutes.
So why did you stay?
The money. I had children. I mean, money, benefits. I have a house. My husband worked at Inco. That's where I met him. We have a house paid for. Why? I have a car in the driveway paid for. Why? Because after Murph's 6 kids
Mm.
all went to college, paid for.
Yeah.
Those are my reasons. My dad was a miner. He was a hard rock miner, 43 years. He was also a paratrooper during World War II. My mother was a WAC during World War II. I come from a good stock of people. My dad had worked in the anode when he first started working at Inco before he went underground. He knew how dangerous it was. He knew that I should be really careful, but he also knew my personality, that I would just keep doing it no matter what. So they were quite proud of me. Unfortunately, I lost my mom early, but my husband that I was married to at the first, he was not happy with me being there. But then that's the reason I stayed, was to get away from him. I stayed single for a long time. I dated a guy from Hamilton for 2 years, Val Patrick, great friend still. And he told me about you, Debbie, back in the days. So that's the reason I stayed, and my family was very supportive over it. So that was my stepping stones, was my family, you know.
That's good to know. What about you, Debbie? How did your friends and family take you taking on this huge job?
I think people were very proud of me. It was a very transformative experience. It changed me. I got tremendous good stuff from it. I mean, listening to Cathy, and I've talked to quite a few women who were like Cathy, quite a few of the women who were part of my team, our team, like in the same book, in Jennifer's book, there's that, I hadn't seen that in so long. There's this great picture of myself and Jeanette Eason and Joanne Santucci. And Joanne Santucci would be, Cathy, a bit like your story in the sense that her dad worked at Stelco. All her brothers worked at Stelco. Her brother, Angelo Santucci, played for the Edmonton Eskimos. And she was, she was just not going to take it that she couldn't do what everybody else in her family. Jeanette Eason was a bit also like your story in the sense that she was a single mom, and she was one of our first five. And the other woman with myself in the coke ovens was very much, she was a mom, had a 3-year-old as well. That was so interesting when you said that, and a husband. And it was, double what she could make in any job. So the vast majority of women who went into industrial jobs did them for the economic reasons that Cathy describes. And they were, really the heroines of this movement and broke into that industrial space. And I guess what I feel terrible listening to your story, Cathy, is almost everyone I've met what had so much damage done to them by the experience. And that's what makes me furious about our naivety, again, in the women's movement, about some of this stuff. Like, again, not protecting us at all. Not me, not Cathy, not Jeanette, not Joanne. I mean, it was like sacrificial lambs, all of us, in a really horrible way. In my story, what happened was from a very positive, so when you go in the coke ovens, your first couple of months, you just shovel coke. And, I would push this wheelbarrow full of coke, and guys would, wave to me from the bridge, and everybody, it was like a real honeymoon for the first 4 or 5 months. And there was no harassment, and everybody was pretty happy about the whole situation. But I could go back to pee in my own trailer because I was outside the coke ovens, and there were 2 of us on different shifts. We never saw each other. She was the woman who had the 3-year-old, and everything was kind of okay for the first few months. And then the summer came, and some summer students came, and some of the summer students were women. And by that time, I'd already worked my way through seniority of being there for a few months to the privilege of going up to the ovens. And the ovens, I don't know what they were like in the 70s at Inco, but at Stelco, it's why Stelco went broke, is they refused to automate the way that, I mean, we even knew in 1979 that the Japanese and German steel industries had automated. And of course, you, Cathy, or I, or anybody could have driven the machines that opened up the ovens. But in those days, we had to we had to jump on this thing and crack open coke oven, the lid, and it was all gummy. And in my first month up there, two guys died, one of lung cancer, one of stomach cancer, within that month, right? So the guys who worked in the coke ovens, all of them did not have grade 12 education. They were people who could not have gotten jobs at Stelco anywhere else. They were totally exploited. It was very much, as Cathy said, the time of the health and safety. I tried to organize a stoppage. Of course, nobody followed me anywhere into anything, right? It was a completely insane thing. Like, I thought I was going to organize a work stoppage. And one of the guys, Robinson, began writing really horrible graffiti about one of the young women. And of course, in my total stupidity, I got into a graffiti war with them. So he would write terrible things about her, and I would write things, and I carried my big black magic marker. This is what I looked like. I guess you guys can see that, eh?
Oh, wow. Can we have a copy of that picture?
Yeah, I've got a few things for you that we can
Yeah,
get
great.
copies of. I mean, this was on my last day, and I think Sue knows for sure, and I think even Tara knows Brett Smiley. So Brett took this picture on my last day. He was another guy in our far left group of school. And Brett, by the way, could lead the guys anywhere. Brett was a big guy, and it was he was charismatic in all of our work, but in there, if he had stayed for a couple of decades, those guys would have followed him anywhere. They saw him as a natural leader in a way that they just weren't interested in hearing what I had to say about anything. But I had a whole system. I put Nivea all over my face, and I wore a sweatshirt underneath everything. And and my mother was driving me crazy because she kept saying, "You're never going to get pregnant." This was a couple of years before I got pregnant, and so there was all that fear. So in terms of family stuff, but mostly people, of course, were, it was Cathy. It was just so pathetic in terms of, again, class privilege, of the way in which a university educated woman like myself can just sail through this experience pretty well unscathed. I mean, not completely unscathed, because I had to quit because the harassment was too much. Because, yeah, Robinson said, a woman's place is in the home unless it is here with legs spread. So I brought my little magic marker and I wrote, "A woman's place is anywhere she wants to be." So we were off to the races then. And then I came in, and then a couple of days later, and Robinson had taken center spreads of girly magazines and put it absolutely everywhere. You couldn't see, it was a very creative graffiti thing he did. He completely filled the walls with beaver shots everywhere, like the ceiling, the walls, the bathroom, all these, again, older immigrant men, they were all like eating their lunch. Cause I learned to play euchre from the guys, and me and the older immigrant guys, we played euchre. We had a great time. And I was thinking, Cathy, when you were talking about your notes, I have my notes, which I should have brought, but I can bring them out later when Sue or Tara come by. Did you have paper towel? Did you have rolls of paper towel, right?
No,
that was my stationery.
We had hand towels, just the ordinary paper hand towels.
Yeah, well, I guess they were a little nicer to us. They put these big rolls of this.
Oh yeah, no.
Paper towel on the. Yeah, we were luxury. We had luxury in Hamilton. Yeah. So I would take, and the guys would do it. They were very clean. The guys, they would put, especially the older guys, they would put it down. Their wives, they would open the lunch, and that was our placemats. So that was my stationery that I wrote. So I have some of the great graffiti on some of that. So it got pretty intense in terms of, and then they would, very much, Cathy, like your experience, they would speak on the microphone, because there are these, of course, trains going throughout the whole system. And they would go, Field's a lesbian, or, Field sucks cock, or whatever it was that they were going to do. And so we did begin to worry that I would not be safe. And Then in a classic Debbie moment, I had a media disaster. I went to a meeting at McMaster that was the first meeting on sexual harassment at a university. I think it was like we were just beginning to even use those words, sexual harassment, in the workplace. And Harrison Jane, who teaches at McMaster, was writing a book and was an expert, so-called, on sexual harassment. And he was describing it as if it was all blue collar working class men.
No.
And I knew that wasn't true, because when my previous job at OPSU, when I was the first equal opportunity rep for a union, my brothers in the union had put a pin up on my door my first day at work. They had welcomed me to my job at OPSU with a sun pin up. So I told that story, and I said, look, it's not working class men, it's not blue collar men, it's white collar men, it's all men. This is the way it is, and we have a problem in the workplace. So next day, page 3 of the Hamilton Spectator, the big picture of me, and it said, ex-community college teacher says sexual harassment at Stelco is rampant. And so then what happened is everybody's girlfriends and wives and mothers started hassling the men. They would say to the guys, what are you doing to them? What's going on? Are you raping them? I was so sad to hear that, Cathy, that you had that experience, right?
I was even sadder.
I can imagine. Terrible.
Yeah.
But the threat of violence was there. And so we decided that I should leave, because I couldn't get any support from the guys to help me with this. Even that shop steward, who was my one friend, basically took their side, and I couldn't get the union to help me, as you couldn't, right? And we had no ability. There was a women's committee. I was in the women's committee at both my own local, and of course, by that time I was even going to conventions and stuff. But again, in retrospect, it cannot be the way it was, that we would be so isolated and that we would have to do these things on our own and face what you faced. And again, over the decades, I've met women from all across North America who've had the kind of terrible experiences, Cathy, that you had.
Yeah.
I slept with a shotgun. I slept with a shotgun under my bed.
Oh, Cathy.
And I think it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. This man from my shift shows up, banging on my front door, saying, open up this door, you fucking union bitch. So I got my gun, but I couldn't find the bullets, because I took a safety course that said, don't put them together. Couldn't find them in the dark. I called the police came. The guy was a guy from my shift with his wife. They are both drunk out of their minds, coming home from a party, but just figured that he could show up at my place. A single mother with 2 children in bed in the middle of the night? No. So the police officer said, is that gun loaded? I said, no, I couldn't find the bullets. He said, what were you going to do with it? And I said, I was hoping to scare him away. That's what else you going to do with an empty gun? But I figured, it would scare him away. When I got back to work, he was furious. He came to the table and he was working on the furnace. So he had a lot of burn holes on his clothing, because copper splashes and it burns. So I said, if I would have shot you with my shotgun, it would have made the same pattern. Do not show up at my place ever again. So he was really mad, but he didn't show up anymore. And what gave him that right? Why did he think he had that right to come to my place? A lot of things like that happened, over the years, where men thought, oh, I can show up with a bottle of beer or a bottle of wine. No, you can't be coming to my place. This is my place. But like I said, the electrical staples, my cat was killed, my hose was busted and cut into little pieces. Now that's scary. That means somebody was in my backyard with a knife cutting my hose. How that kind of hate towards somebody. And then the thing with the pictures, their Hustler magazines came out and they were really gross. I never even seen a Playboy magazine, let alone a Hustler. And they did the same thing. They posted them all over the walls and that. But whomever's up there had an eye on me because I took my mom to the secondhand store to get some books. And on the floor were a bunch of magazines. So when I started thumbing through them, they were of naked men, all at the ready, like this. Absolutely wonderful. I bought them all. My mom said, Cathy, don't do this. You're going to get in trouble. I said, Mom, the boss told me it's part of the culture. So I am just going along with that. So I had to hide them because they had a key for my locker, right? So I couldn't have them in my locker. We finally got a woman's washroom, 5 years, and it had those square tiles on the ceiling. So I climbed up onto the sink, removed it, stuck all my magazines up there with my Scotch tape, and little by little, I'd take them out and I started posting them beside theirs because I knew if I tore them down, I would get in trouble for touching somebody else's property. Well, after a few weeks of that, and the women, I'd open up the fridge and a naked woman would roll out. Well, now a naked man rolled out. So they were not happy. I was called in the office. I was told that they didn't like my attitude, that I had a bad attitude. And I said, I'll make a deal with you. If they want to read these magazines, do it when you're in the crane. Do it when you're in the bathroom. Just don't put them on the walls because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I'm going to continue. Then they wanted to know where my books were. I said, I don't know. I don't remember where I put them. Right? So that worked because now the magazines were not in the lunchroom anymore. And that's all I really wanted. Because as a young woman coming from a Roman Catholic background, never seen any kind of this stuff. And the comments of what they were going to do to these women. And the other men, the Italian men that sat like that, staying quiet, they were just as much to blame for not saying anything. So
Yeah.
I had to do it myself. I had to fight it myself.
So
with
did you have
graffiti. Go ahead.
did you have a women's committee at your
We
place of
did
work?
later, yes, we did, and it was wonderful. We started seeing each other at Christmas parties. We'd invite the other women. So I'd say maybe 15 of us from all over would show up at these Christmas parties. Then we started a women's committee, which was really good and progressive. But that's when we had a progressive union. Dave Patterson and the lefties of the group. That's when it became the best. We had marches. We had, we had things where people could learn how to do things like what the steward does. All those kinds of things were welcomed. When Dave Patterson won and we lost him, then everything changed. The women's committee was not the same. They were starting to do things like gathering purses for the poor or something to that effect, which was not interesting to me. But
All
we
right.
were progressive for quite a while.
Yeah, that's great. Now tell us a bit about the strike then.
The big strike in 78 and 79.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
And
we
you'd had
ahead.
layoffs before that, right?
78, 79 was a big turning point in my life. I was really young. I was 23 about, and they asked us to get involved. And I was still with that other guy, and I knew that I didn't want to rock the boat too much at home, but I did join the union, and of course they made me making egg salad sandwiches for the striking guys that were on the picket line. But I didn't know I was allergic to eggs, so I was not feeling very good. Dave Patterson said, we'll put you on the voucher committee. And that's when my life changed. I learned about the splits of the union, the right and the left, the beliefs, the non-beliefs, and how the right side tried to set me up during the strike for different things that they did, and how I fought back with them.
Cathy, it's such an honor and a privilege to be here with you and to
Well, thank you, Deb.
I've always loved reading. I think you and I saw each other maybe just once at a
We did,
conference.
we
And
did,
it's
yes.
still
I,
worth it.
I have a really good memory for stuff like that.
Yeah,
Yes,
no,
yes,
and
we
I do
did
too.
meet.
We did
We
meet,
did.
and it's
I
great.
want to show you my book.
It's great. Well, I'm going to definitely look to get it. So I'm very impressed you did it. And I think there's a really important role, especially for you, Cathy. I wouldn't presume, but I think they need to hear more and more from you still now, the younger women who are still doing this and still being set up. And I loved the way your story worked itself out. I mean, in my own head, that's what I figured out later, was I needed humor and I needed to, within the culture of unity with the guys, figure it out a different way. So what happened, and then I'll just bridge it then to the strike. So what happened is we knew a strike was coming. And I think, shy a few days of my year of lasting, surviving. So we decided that it was probably just a good idea for me to leave and in fact, when I hear your story, I realize it's true. I was at a threat. I was really at a threat physically.
Yeah.
And emotionally too, right? And the damage. So I left, the strike happened, all 180 women were laid off. And there was only one woman who was called back, who was Bettina Clark. And I think maybe Sue, you might remember her name. Yeah. So, she was a welder. So she was called back, but 179 of us weren't, right? So that was the end of women back into Stelco, literally in 1 year. And again, the seniority thing, and that was one of our demands, that there be differential seniority rate so that we would have stayed in at least 180, percentage wise of us.
Yeah.
But was it a good thing? Maybe not. And I think there are some really important lessons there. I'd be fascinated to find out what is going on, for the Cathy and Debbie's of, this year in terms of where we are on these issues. But big education there, I think, around understanding that, because it could have been so different. And as Cathy proved through her humor way, I think that the guys were not the barrier, actually, if you had come with allies of a different kind, right? So I think it did change quite a few things in terms of pay rates. I think we did do that. I think that was an important piece to the puzzle and part of the story of the equalization of women's wages over these 30 years. So I think Cathy and I did a good thing. I'm certainly proud of it. It's one of my proudest feelings and accomplishments. I wouldn't have traded it for the world, because what I learned was that the men understood the system completely. Like, when, Cathy, if you can believe it, Sue and I were in a group that actually believed that the problem was the working class didn't understand Marxism or the labor theory of value, and that if somebody just whispered it in their ear, they'd kind of get it. But what I learned from all the guys I worked with, they understood completely. And the reason they didn't do the work stoppages was they didn't want to be victimized. Or they didn't think there was any point in this kind of action because they saw it backfiring. So there's some very humbling and important things that many of us learned from being able to observe what people understood. So in that way, I learned a lot. And
One thing I want to say something is that I am talking to younger women. I've spoken 4 times at Laurentian University here in Sudbury, and Carleton bought 10 books. They're putting it in the curriculum. It's so exciting, in January. And I've done an hour and a half presentation with slides, and they're using that as well. And then, depending on COVID, they want me to go later after they've read the book. The girls have read the book, and then we can chit chat. Oh, it's just very exciting. It's so exciting, All right, in 78, we had a strike. The International Union had told us not to strike, but we had already agreed. We knew it was a setup. The company had stockpile of nickel to last a year. So we were already screwed. They wanted us to do a year and then come back with the contract, but then that was no good for us either, because then they'd have even more stockpile. So we, the people, decided to go on strike. I joined the group, started off with sandwiches, moved to the voucher committee. That's when I learned about how the union has a split between the right side and the left side, which I didn't understand what that meant at the time. But there were things that are in the book that they set me up many times, many times. But we started doing speeches in Toronto and in Hamilton. We went to Hamilton for a week and we raised, what did we raise? It was like 40,000 or something dollars,
Wow.
which went to the drug committee because people didn't have any money for life-sustaining drugs like for your heart, insulin, all those kinds of things that are life-sustaining. They couldn't afford it on $30 a week. So we went plant gating different plants all over Southern Ontario, all over Northern Ontario, and standing there with our little pails and like 30 degrees below, collecting money. And that was a great experience for me.
How did it all end then? What?
So the ending was wonderful because the bargaining committee had come back with a plan that said we want you to accept this. But we had been out for 8.5 months, or 8 months at that time, and it wasn't good enough for being out that long. So the union said to accept it. The international said to accept it. The bargaining committee said to accept it. But the people said no. The story goes that the wives had forced the men back to work, which is a total lie. And there's a DVD. Hang on a sec. We had filmmakers come from Montreal and they did this film. It's called A Wives' Tale. It's in French and English. And they tell the true story of what really happened in 1958. A bunch of film people, 3 of them came from Montreal.
Yeah.
And they put this together called A Wives' Tale. And
Right.
it's in French and English. And it talks about the true story of what happened in 1958, that the wives did not push the men back. So the wives had that over their head when we went into this big strike, because the men thought the wives were going to be a negative thing, which of course they weren't. They were the power behind the strike, believe it or not. And there was only a handful of them, I was an honorary member of the wives supporting the strike. My t-shirt said, I support wives supporting the strike.
They did things like collect money, make food.
Oh, they started off doing, as one woman puts it in the movie, womanly duties. But as you watch the film, you see how people changed and how their politics started to grow and the realization of their voices. And they weren't sitting there knitting. They were on the picket line. They were helping us do what we had to do. So it was a great learning experience for all of us.
So you said you didn't want to go back. You didn't want to accept the contract. Is that right?
No, we didn't. We turned the contract down and we won. So that was the big celebration. 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, the bargaining committee came back and we got 30 and out, which is so important. That means 30 years of service, doesn't matter your age, full pension. I was 49 years old when I got my 30 years.
Wow.
I owed them a couple of months, so I turned 50 and then I retired.
It is amazing when you think back now, because I mean, you were only earning about $6 an hour, weren't you?
$6 an hour, yeah.
Which was a lot of money in those days. Yeah.
It was, yes. I think the average wage was $1.60 something, like at stores and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So $6 was a lot of money.
So you were there for 30 years or more?
30
Yeah.
years. Oh yeah. I retired as soon as I got my 30. I was out of there.
That's
but
great.
They forced me out, and that's in this book. I'm not going to tell you that story. You'll have to read the book.
I've got up to the wives.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
It's very good. Yeah, it's very good. Okay, so what happened? How did they force you out?
Well, it was a setup because I ran against the union boys. You'll see all that. I ran against the union boys, so they were mad at me. And then there was inconsistencies in how the votes were counted, sort of like a Trump thing going on, you know. So I was buried. I was buried, and I had a title, but I wasn't allowed to do that job. So they buried me, gave me a nice little office. As long as I didn't talk to anybody, any steel workers, they put me in an engineer building where everybody was staff. But that's where because I didn't have a job description, nobody talked to me. I learned my computer. I learned how to surf on the computer. I started a library of safety and health. I did all that on my own. I had no boss over my head. So
And how long did you do that for?
I started that in 94, I think it was, or 93. I started teaching. I went back to school. I got a day shift job. So I went back to school, got my teaching certificate for teachers of adults. I got in and I did first aid and CPR. Then I moved on to safety and health and environment. And at Inco, it's called safety, health, and environment. But in all the other places, it's health, safety, and environment. But the steelworkers didn't want to change that. So when I'd answer the phone, I'd say, she training. Yeah, that was my little joke, my little jab. You know?
Oh, that's great. So you were elected to this. This was a position you were elected to?
No, not exactly. Because they didn't know, the company didn't know what to do with me, and the union didn't know what to do with me. This job came up because they were going to teach everything from respirators to PPE to everything, right? And I wanted in. And so because I was now an injured worker because I hurt my shoulder, I got that job because I was a PPE. I mean a PPD, partially permanently disabled.
Yeah.
And so I got that job. And then the union guys didn't want to work with me. So I ended up running the whole show, my own safety and health courses. I loved it. I didn't need them.
Yeah, right. That's great. Okay, so what would you, if you were talking to young women today who are thinking about going into a place like Inco or Stelco or whatever, what lessons do you think you would tell them you learned?
First of all, I tell them to take the job because it's only 30 years of your life, first of all, which is not all your life. You do it because the money is great and the opportunities for women are still not that great. They're just not that great. So yes, do it. And if you learn a trade, whether it be a plumber or electrician, anything like that, you can go anywhere in the world. And that's so important to know. You can be a hairdresser, sure. You can be a nurse. Any kind of trade that you do, you can go anywhere you want to go. And that's the thing I would push on young women nowadays because they might not want to be a plumber, but they could try it out. They could become an electrician. They could become a welder, and you can have TIG welding and can't think of the name of the different weldings right now. But there's all kinds of welding, you know. So there's so much to do in these kinds of jobs. So much you could learn. So you get dirty, so you shower. It's not a big deal.
Right. Great. And how do you think that the job affected your politics throughout,
Did
throughout?
the job affect my politics?
Yeah, you working in Inco affect your politics. You started off, you said, very naive.
Oh, I learned a lot. And power is knowledge. My dad used to say that all the time to us. Power is knowledge. And it's true. It's true. Once you learn your rights and you can use it against foremen that aren't maybe that bright, that have never understood or taken the time to learn the laws. By being an employee, by learning your rights, it only can work in your behalf. That's what I would tell kids. Learn your rights. Learn how the law works.
We really want to acknowledge that you've written this fantastic book.
Yes.
You want to hold it up for us?
As you can see, the picture behind me is done by an artist here in Sudbury. Her name is Jana Kobelka. She did that painting for me. I did the drawing and I asked her to do it. She added her own stuff because she is the artist. This is the book. It's a big book. Yes, it's a big book. You must have read that at the beginning because when Inco and the other mining companies came in, there was no respect for the land. They raped the land. They burnt the trees. The sulfur and stuff that they used in the open arc furnaces, the big roasting beds. That's why they called it nickel, because the Germans called it nickel, meaning devil copper, because they were here for the copper, because it's easy, the softest to work with. It's a good material. It's still hard, but easy to work with. So they just, and they came and they killed the animals. There were hundreds and thousands of animals, shot them for sport, leaving their carcasses where they were. It was such a bad attitude. But now Sudbury is green. The lakes are clean. They're stocked. There's animals again, even in my backyard, so I think the world could look at Sudbury and say, well, you know what? If they could do that in this little part of Ontario, we can clean the earth. And that's another thing I always tell the young girls when I go in to speak. It's important to pick up your garbage. Don't leave your popcorn when you're in the show. Go and put it in the garbage. Don't leave it for somebody else, because it's up to you. So I try to push that as well.
The book is called My View from the Blackened Rocks, and it's by Cathy Mulroy, and it tells the whole story of her experiences over 30 years in the Inco, in the Inco mine.
A woman's battle for equality and respect in Canada's mining industry. That's all I wanted, was respect from those people.
Yeah,